In 1948, Ruby Chow and her husband opened the restaurant, the first one outside of Seattle's Chinatown district. This would be one of the first events that would solidify Ruby's legacy, and she would be a cultural ambassador for Seattle. She will create a turning point in the history of Seattle by being the bridge between Chinese Americans and the Seattle community. Her life would be plagued by the word first. First Chinese restaurant outside of Chinatown, first Asian American politician for King County, first Chinese frozen food business, and first female president of the Changhua chapter. Her role in demystifying tensions between these Chinese Americans and the Seattle community would be aided by introducing Chinese culture to Seattle. In the early 1850s, Chinese immigrants would come to America with the intention to work and gain money for their family. These immigrants would work as cooks, being servants, laundrymen, gold mining, and building western railroads. These jobs would not pay much, as railroad builders would only be paid $1 a day. This dollar they were paid would be spent on their own equipment and food, essentially being paid nothing. An economic depression would be widespread in Washington, and Chinese Americans were wrongfully blamed for the depression. Hostilities began stirring against Chinese Americans working in these jobs, and by 1882, the U.S. would implement the Chinese Exclusion Act, halting immigration for Chinese Americans for a decade. And in November of 1885, a huge 300-man mob in Tacoma drove 700 Chinese out of their homes and forced them into wagons. 2 Chinese people would die. Washington would need someone or something to show that abuse toward Chinese Americans needed to end. At the beginning of the 20th century, Ruby's parents, Jim Singmar and Wang Si, would come to the Pacific Northwest. Jim would work as a Western Railroad builder, along with some 3,000 other Chinese immigrants. He would later manage the San Juan Fishing and Canning Company dock in the Seattle waterfront, where the Seattle Aquarium is now located. Jim and Wang would bore 10 children, with Ruby being the oldest girl, born on June 6, 1920. Jim would pass away when Ruby was 12 in 1932. His death would be very untimely because the family would be left all alone during the Great Depression. Wang Si and her children would struggle vigorously to get by. While Wang sold lottery tickets, the boys in the family would have to scavenge around in the back of restaurants to find leftover food. During this period, there were only 2 people helping the family get by, one of which was the Superior Court Judge mother, Warren Chan. Without these 2 people, the family probably would have not survived, so my mom felt she had to give back, said by Ruby herself. Ruby would go to high school until she was 16, when she had to drop out of school to provide for her family. She worked as a waitress and as a Dollar Tree salesgirl. Ruby went to New York for a brief marriage in 1937, where she bore 2 sons, Edward and Shelton. Wang Si would die in 1939, leaving Ruby and her siblings with no parents. During her time in New York, Ruby worked at a gay bar named the Howdy Club. Here, she would gain empathy for the gay community, and this would be motivation for her role as a civil activist. During her last year in New York in 1943, she would meet her future husband and best friend, Ping Chow. Ping, Chow, and Ruby Chow would go to Seattle after the meeting and marriage in 1943. They found jobs at a restaurant in Chinatown called the Hong Kong. As an enticement to keep the couple working there, the owner of the restaurant would give Ping a few shares of the company. Ruby would again work as a waitress at this restaurant. After finishing working there, in 1948, Ruby and Ping would purchase an old mansion and convert it into their very own restaurant. They named this restaurant after Ruby, simply being named Ruby Chow's Restaurant. This would be the first restaurant to open outside of the Chinatown district. Ruby would work as the hostess and everything else, and Ping would work as the chef. This restaurant would be a local hotspot for famous figures and celebrities to come and have a hangout. Public officials, reporters, and the political industry were examples of the people who would dine at Ruby's restaurant. The restaurant's dishes would be rather cheap, being priced at $1.25 for a regular meal. During the early years of running the restaurant, the Chows gained 3 more children, Cheryl Chow, Brian Chow, and Mark Chow. The family would live in the upstairs section of the restaurant. The children were set with high expectations from Ruby. The kids would have to help around the restaurant along with their parents, washing dishes, vacuuming, busting, and waiting the tables. The restaurant would be labeled as an overnight success, and her restaurant would soon make Ruby well known and successful in the city of Seattle. She would be a cultural ambassador for the Chinese citizens in the city, illustrating that they're important and needed.
Ruby's earliest accomplishment after building her restaurant would be starting a campaign with her husband Ping Chow. This campaign would be achieved by her and her husband inviting the public to a variety of different Chinese traditions, such as Lunar New Year. With these traditions, they had the goal in mind to give Chinatown a positive image. Ruby and Ping would also cook traditional Chinese dishes on King TV's channel named King Queens. They hosted a cooking show for 2 years straight, and on a separate TV channel named KSTW TV. Shortly after their success in hosting this campaign, they helped a girls group named Chiets form a Chinese community drill team. Ruby's passion and the motivation to make Seattle a better place would be reflected from this group. She would encourage these girls to develop social skills and their self-esteem. She would also add Chinese flavor to Seattle's annual Seafair Torchlight Parade. These cultural activities were traditionally limited to men, but with Ruby, she encouraged them to do these traditions.
And there are about 75 girls involved, and every year they go out and perform. And we got them their uniforms in Hong Kong.
In the last 12 years of her career, she would pursue a career in politics to represent King County. Although, in her standpoint of being apolitical, many suggested her to be a Democrat, as it is more people-oriented. She would campaign for her role in a seat in King County and compete against African-American civil activist Walter Hubbard Jr. Ruby would go on to win against him by 220 votes, being the first Asian American to be elected in King County's council. She would go on and continue for re-election for 12 years straight, creating several changes during her terms. Ruby would lobby for more shelters being built in Seattle and persuaded Seattle to build a tennis court in the south, not a second one in the north. This small change would demonstrate her drive for equality, her saying that things should be fair. Nearing the end of her campaigns, critics in the Chinese community would rise and support another African American politician, Ron Sims, and defeat Ruby Chow. When speaking about her critics, Ruby says, "My conscience is clear, and I do what I can, and if they don't like it, that's tough." She would finish her terms in November of 1984 when she was 64. Here, she would officially retire from the workforce, leasing her restaurant in 1979. The action she took during her career would eventually cause impacts all over the world. An example is Bruce Lee. Because of Ruby's work she gave to Bruce Lee, she impacted him for his success later in his career. Bruce Lee would introduce the rest of the world to the power and strength of the Chinese community. Bruce Lee, through numerous famous movies, would display his martial arts skill and illustrate that anyone could be successful. Ruby's career continues today through her children, passing on the passion and compulsion for community service. Her children will work as politicians, start companies, and become war veterans.
Ruby Chow and her husband Ping Chow opened Seattle's first Chinese restaurant outside of the city's Chinatown district. This would solidify Ruby's legacy in Seattle, and she would be a cultural ambassador for the city. She would make a turning point in the history of Seattle by creating a bridge between Chinese Americans in the Seattle community by introducing Chinese culture to the city and aiding in demystifying tensions and prejudice against Chinese Americans. Her significance was needed for the state of Washington for the fact that Chinese racism was plagued there for years. She was the pioneer for all actions taken for the Chinese Americans for the 20th century, setting a precedent for future activists. Ruby Chow's belief that Chinese Americans needed a louder voice would be the catalyst for all her civic actions throughout her life, and she would impact changes in the Pacific Northwest for centuries to come.